So I've got good news and I've got bad news. The bad news is when I pulled up to my fishing spot the other day, there were like 5 or 6 cars there, and it's a really small fishing spot with very little room to fish from the bank. And so I basically was squeezed into one spot, and because I was around a lot of people, I really didn't talk throughout this video. I didn't really add any context. I didn't talk about what I was doing, so on and so forth. The good news is I did catch a lot of fish, and actually, more importantly, I learned a lot during this trip. And so today I'm actually really excited to be sitting here in the man cave. And what I'm gonna do is while I show the fishing footage, I'm going to add some color about some of the key learnings and takeaways which I had. So let's get into it. Now, a little bit of context. So this fishing spot has been good to me the last few years. I discovered it randomly one day in the spring when I was actually doing a little bit of multi-species fishing, a little bit of bass fishing. I found some fish there. I determined that they were perch. I realized that they were on the verge of spawning, and I have patterned this time and time again, and these fish do return, and it seems to be an area that's kind of like a spawning area for the fish. The nice thing is, you can get there from a boat or a kayak, but you can also reach it from bank. And so that's why I went back. Now, actually, I was there the day prior and I caught a few fish. So I was definitely optimistic on this day because the water was probably warming because we had better weather trends. But I was actually there the weekend prior as well, both Saturday and Sunday, and I didn't catch anything on those days. So my theory was that things are going to be heating up, but it would probably be somewhat slow. So I got out there and I started out trying a couple of different lures, but I knew that in my heart, the ultralight drop shot was probably going to be the play. So I quickly put down my other setups and I picked up the ultralight drop shot. Now, the ultralight drop shot is what I caught fish on the day before, so I knew it was going to work. And there were some specific spots that I was trying to target, and basically I was whipping this thing out there, and I pretty quickly started catching fish. Now, I'll be honest with you, I wasn't catching fish like every cast by any means. It was definitely pretty slow, but I would say the bite was pretty consistent. I would probably catch a fish every 5 to 6 minutes. Definitely had to slow down, really pick it apart. The water was pretty dirty. Now, like I said, I have some key takeaways from this fishing trip, and if you looked at the title of this video, really one of the big takeaways that I want to talk about is related to gear and gear quality. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about price. I'm talking about the type of gear you choose, the quality of gear you choose. It doesn't necessarily mean spending hundreds of dollars. It just means the specifics of the type of stuff that you're using. And I'm gonna kind of add color to that. So the reason I bring this up is because I was around, like I said, several anglers. When I got there, everybody was there. They had bobbers on. They were fishing live minnows. They were fishing artificials, but they were fishing under a float. And I happened to be next to a guy that talked a lot and shared a lot. And he shared to me that some people had left earlier and they had quite a few perch in a bucket, and they went home with quite a few perch. And I was like, yeah, sure, that makes sense, right? But he was talking about, well, I haven't caught squat though. They were catching all these fish, and they were catching them on chartreuse. Make sure to try chartreuse. I didn't try chartreuse. I happened to be using a black horsefly, but basically what I knew from that is that there's fish here, they're willing to bite, but everyone around me was not catching anything. And I want to be very clear before I go into this. I've been there. This is not an ego play by any means. Usually I'm the angler not catching fish and I'm watching other people catch fish. On this particular day, I was the angler catching fish around a lot of people that didn't catch really anything. So what I was using was a drop shot, which is obviously a bottom oriented bait. These other anglers were primarily using stuff that's going to either be towards the bottom, towards the middle. It's going to be a suspended offering. If it's under a bobber, it's likely going to be a suspended offering. Now, they weren't catching anything, like I said, and it was a combination of live bait and artificials. And then all of a sudden, I was catching some fish, and I was trying to be pretty, quiet about it. I wasn't really trying to draw attention to myself. But they started to notice. There was a couple guys that started to notice that I was catching fish. And all of a sudden, I look over, and some of these guys happen to be using a drop shot. They had a bobber on, they took it off, they put on a drop shot. But here's where the learning takes place. They fished for 20 or 30 minutes, maybe even more, and they were using a drop shot, similar setup, similar rig, I should say, but they didn't catch any fish. Now, what were the key differences? When I looked over, I noticed that the drop shot they were using, one of the biggest things that I want to take away is they had a huge weight on that thing. I bet it was at least a half ounce, probably more, to be honest with you, which was crazy. It was one of those big, like, pyramid looking things, like a reverse pyramid. It looked like it would actually, like, it could really hurt you if someone casted it at you. It's got a point on the end of it. I think it's primarily used for really, really deep water, but in this case, we were fishing like 10 to 12 feet of water, and the individuals happened to be using really, really large drop shot weights. And as I was watching that, and they weren't catching any fish, I couldn't help but think to myself, they might be getting bites, but they're probably not feeling them. And quite honestly, when the fish do bite, they're probably letting go right away because they immediately feel the resistance of that weight. I was using a 1/8 ounce tungsten drop shot weight. Now this is important for ultralight drop shot fishing. I'm not necessarily saying that you have to use this specific size, but what I am saying is that if you use too heavy of a weight, it is going to kill the action of your bait, and it's also going to deter those fish from biting your lure and holding your lure. When a perch grabs the tail of that worm or it grabs your bait and it immediately feels that really heavy resistance on the bottom of your rig, they're gonna let go. The other thing is, what is that angler going to feel when they have a huge piece of metal on the end of their line? They're only gonna feel the resistance from that metal. They'll never feel the fish just nipping at their lure. And I wanna be very clear, like I mentioned, these fish were not crazy aggressive. These fish were nipping at it a little bit. They were picking it up real soft. You really had to pay attention. So it was really important that you could feel those bites. And that, my friends, is a key takeaway. The weight size was a big factor. I genuinely believe that. Now, as we move away from the weight, the next thing I want to talk about is the bait I was using. Obviously, I own Mule Fishing, so I was using a horsefly. This is tried and true for me. I love it on a drop shot. It works really well for panfish. It works really well for a lot of different fish, but perch is definitely one I have a ton of confidence for. And I was using the black one at the beginning of the video. I eventually switched to the red dirt, as you'll see at the end of the video. In this case, I've got a red dirt rigged up here. Doesn't really matter the color is what I guess I'm getting to, but the point was it's a small 1.5 inch lure. When I looked over to the other individuals, I'm not necessarily saying they weren't using small lures, but I believe that mine was a little bit more of a smaller, natural, appeal to those fish. Yellow perch probably were feeding a lot on insect larvae in that case. And there's a lot of wood down there, a little bit of vegetation, and it feels like a great spot for some of those insect larvae to be kind of hatching. And quite honestly, panfish, they just go nuts for insect larvae. So I was catching a lot of fish on this. I think that the other lures that I was seeing thrown out there, and even live bait, just weren't really mimicking what the fish wanted. And at the same time, they may have been just a little on the large size. Now, when you look at this bait, the other thing you're going to notice is a very, very small hook. Similar to the drop shot weight, my friends, that's really important. That small hook does a couple of things. Number one, it gives your lure a ton of action. It gives your lure less material inside of it. So basically what that does is it creates a more free-flowing action in your lure. If I had a giant hook rigged all the way halfway back the plastic, it's going to reduce the amount of quiver that plastic can have. So that smaller hook is going to give it more action. The other thing it's going to do is it's going to be less intrusive to fish. So when they mouth that bait, they're not going to feel as much metal and they're going to hold on. And again, because I have that light drop shot weight and I can really feel things down there, my friends, it all kind of adds up. And I'm able to feel the bites, I'm able to set the hook once they have it, and it all goes hand in hand. So again, this system really, really worked well for me. I really, really like that small hook paired with that light weight. But ultimately, the next thing I need to get to is the setup I was using. This is a 6'6" ultralight. This one happens to be the Temple Fork Pastime, but disregard the price or the quality, more so focus on the specs. 6'6" ultralight, fast action, rated for light line, light lures. 4-pound braided fishing line. Happened to be X braid. Stuff's pretty good. I don't hate it. Pretty good braid. 4-pound braid, 4-pound copolymer leader. I'm willing to bet, obviously I wasn't looking closely, but I'm willing to bet a lot of the anglers next to me were probably using a 6 foot or a 6'6" medium rod. probably using 8-pound test. You know, ultimately what I'm saying is they were using your standard run-of-the-mill spinning rod. Not worried at all about price or anything like that. But the reason this is important, number one, with this little tiny drop shot, I was casting this thing extremely far. An 1/8 ounce weight doesn't always cast really far, but when you have a low diameter line and a lighter rod, you're going to be able to bomb that thing. And that's exactly what I was able to do. I was able to put this thing really wherever I wanted, and I was able to cover a tremendous amount of water. Despite the fact that these other anglers were using these very large drop shot weights, it made it clunky for them to be able to cast where they wanted to, and they weren't getting it in the strike zone from what I could tell. And again, they weren't catching fish. Not judging, just saying facts are facts. They weren't catching fish, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that they weren't putting their lure where they needed to, and then when they did have the lure in the right spot, it was just too heavy and they couldn't feel it, and the fish didn't like it. It just wasn't quite right. We were all fishing one small stretch, but I was the only one catching fish. And a lot of this just has to do with the setup. So the 6'6" rod helped me get more distance, but most importantly was that low diameter line. I was able to bomb it out there and really effectively work it. Now again, this is braid, and to that copolymer leader, it had a very, very solid sensitivity. As I mentioned, these fish were very finicky, very light biters, and I believe that that makes a huge difference. So again, you pair that lightweight and being able to feel those bites, you pair that with that sensitive braid, and then all of a sudden it's game on, baby. You know, you feel that tiny softness to your lure. You're like, why is it feeling a little soft? It's that mushy feeling. It's because a perch is just grabbing it ever so slightly. And you know what? Reel it down, set the hook, boom, caught a fish. So yeah, that was one of my big takeaways, is the fact that really gear can make a huge difference. And again, I've used a lot of different ultralight setups, and I'm not gonna tell you that you need to spend $500 on an ultralight setup. You know, I happen to like this reel. It's a size 1000 reel. You could absolutely get away with like a $40 reel, no issue. This rod is a more expensive rod, but I can tell you, I've used lots of $30 to $50 rods that work great too, and it wouldn't have made any difference. The main difference were the specs and the quality, you know, the quality aspect of my setup, not necessarily the price. So as you can tell, I was catching quite a few fish, and the quality definitely varied. There were some big pregnant females in the mix. There were some small squeaker males in the mix. But all things considered, I was having a great time out there. And the fact that I was looking around and no one was catching fish, even on live bait, was definitely reassuring. As far as how I worked my drop shot, now I'm not gonna go too far into this, but I do wanna, you know, talk about it a little bit. I would basically just cast it out there to where I felt the strike zone was, and I'm gonna talk about that in a minute. And I would just keep my rod tip at an angle up so I could really feel, or I would go to the side to kind of keep it out of the wind, and I just dragged it ever so slightly. And I tried to just keep that bottom contact. And I would just pause it, and I would just be very, very slow with it. Now, when I felt that mushy feeling, or if I felt my line jump a little bit, I would set the hook, and it was game on. Very simple. But the big thing that I want to draw attention to is, where was I casting it? Now, I have a little bit of an advantage on the spot because, again, I have discovered it a few years back, and I've fished it several times, and I've been able to fish it out of my kayak. So I understand what the depth is in that area. And I understand historically where the fish have positioned themselves. Now, this is the other call out that I really do think is important. You can definitely have an advantage when you put in the time and you put in the effort. And these anglers may have been there 1,000 times before this. This may have been their first time. I really have no way of knowing. But what I do know is that I knew exactly where I wanted to cast my lure, and I was putting it in those same spots every time. And when I would put it in those spots, that's when I was going to catch fish. I would fan cast the area and experiment, but at the end of the day, there was really like maybe 2 to 3 spots where I caught all my fish. You know, it's one little area, but there was specific casts I would make. The other anglers were not casting it into those spots, and that definitely made a huge difference from my perspective. And that all just goes to say that when it comes to finding fishing areas, you can still have success around other people. You can still have success in pressured waters. But the big thing is really paying attention to the details, looking for those small things and patterning things over time. I wouldn't have probably caught a lot of these fish had I not done this in the past. Because I put in years of work looking for different places and kind of making mental notes when I do have success, that pays off for years to come. I should note that at the very end of the trip, fortunately, I am thankful to note that the guy next to me that happened to be, you know, talking to me the bulk of the time, he eventually caught, I think, 2 perch. So I was very happy that he was able to pull a couple in. You know, it's funny, when I was in college, There was so many trips where me and my buddy would be out, you know, fishing, bass fishing. It might even be in a tournament half the time. And he would catch all the fish and I wouldn't catch squat. So believe me, this is not an ego thing. This is just me trying to help you guys as well from some of the key learnings that I noticed, because I really do believe that some of the small things can make a big difference. And from my perspective, I learned a lot and I wanted to share that with you. Hey man, I tell you what, we got open water. We've got increasing weather trends. Things are about to get awesome. I love this. I'm so excited to do more of this ultralight fishing, my friends. Make sure to drop a comment below if you have anything that you would like to share as it relates to this video. The other thing is, if you have any specific suggestions for this year on what I should fish with in videos, make sure to let me know. I've got a lot of plans, but I'm always looking for inspiration, so I do appreciate it. Thank you so very much for watching today's video. I know it was a little bit different, but I had fun with it anyways. We'll catch you next time.